Hello everyone, welcome to Get Snoozy, where you relax, you listen, you sleep. Today, we bring you a collection of stories that will tear open the wounds stitched beneath our smiles. Anna crashed through the door, her wedding dress half unzipped, tears streaming down her face as she shouted, "Dad, I'm not marrying him." The clock her father spent months crafting for her wedding, a masterpiece of gears and gold, sat finished on the table the hour she was supposed to say, "I do." Elias's heart stuttered, his calloused fingers tightening around a tiny screwdriver as he realized the day he'd poured his soul into was crumbling before his eyes. Elias had always been a man of time. At 62, he ran a small clock shop in Asheville, North Carolina, a quiet place tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. His hands, rough from years of crafting gears and springs, could coax life into any broken timepiece. He'd raised Anna alone after her mother passed when she was 5, turning their little apartment above the shop into a world of ticking clocks and bedtime stories. Anna was his light, wild-haired, bright-eyed, with a laugh that echoed through the shop like a melody. She grew up fast, helping him wind clocks and sweep sawdust, her small hands learning the trade, even if her heart pulled her elsewhere. By 24, she'd fallen for Jacob, a steady accountant with a kind smile and a family Elias approved of. They'd met at a church picnic, and Jacob had won Elias over with his quiet respect and a promise to take care of Anna. Elias liked him, liked the idea of Anna settled, safe, and when Jacob proposed, Elias threw himself into making the wedding clock. It was his gift, a labor of love, each gear polished to gleam, each chime tuned to ring soft and clear. Anna seemed happy too, or so Elias thought. She'd twirl around the shop in her dress, laughing about flowers and cake, her voice bright as she planned the day. Elias worked late nights, his back aching, his eyes straining under the lamplight, pouring every ounce of himself into that clock. It wasn't just a gift, it was a promise, a father's hope that her future would tick on, steady and true, like the timepieces he'd built his life around. But there were cracks he didn't see. Anna's smiles faltered sometimes, her eyes drifting out the shop window to the mountains beyond. She'd talk about Jacob with warmth, but there was a hesitation Elias missed, a quiet pull he didn't understand. She'd started slipping out at night, coming back with flushed cheeks and vague excuses, and Elias chalked it up to wedding jitters. He didn't know about Sam, didn't know she'd met a drifter with a guitar and a reckless grin at a bar downtown. A man who lit her up in ways Jacob never could. Their love grew in secret. Sam was everything Jacob wasn't. Untamed, free, with stories of the road and a voice that made Anna's heart race. She'd sneak off to meet him, sitting on the hood of his beat-up truck, sharing dreams under the stars. He didn't fit Elias's plans, didn't fit the life she'd been raised for, but he fit her, fit the wildness she'd buried under duty. She loved Jacob too, in a steady, safe way, but Sam was fire, and she couldn't let him go. The wedding day dawned bright and crisp, the church buzzing with guests, the clock Elias had finished gleaming on a table near the altar. He stood in his best suit, pride swelling as he pictured Anna walking down the aisle, the clock chiming noon to mark her vows. He'd carried it there himself, setting it with care, his hands trembling with a mix of nerves and joy. It was perfect. Golden hands, a carved oak case, a tiny engraving of her initials on the back. He'd whispered to it as he worked, keep her happy, keep her safe, like a prayer he'd trusted it to answer. But noon came and went, and Anna didn't appear. The organist faltered, the crowd murmured, and Elias felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Jacob fidgeted at the altar, his smile fading, and Elias's chest tightened with every tick of that clock. Each second louder, sharper, a hammer against his hope. Then the doors flew open, and Anna stumbled in, her dress unzipped, her bouquet abandoned somewhere behind her. "Dad, I can't do it," she said, her voice breaking as she stood there, barefoot and shaking. Elias froze, the screwdriver still in his hand from a last-minute tweak, his mind scrambling to catch up. "I love someone else," she choked out, tears spilling over, and the room spun. Sam's name tumbled from her lips, a drifter, a nobody, and Elias's world cracked apart. She'd chosen Sam that morning, slipped out before dawn to meet him, her heart torn, but certain. They'd driven off in his truck, her dress still on, her resolve hardening with every mile. But guilt had pulled her back, just long enough to face her father, to shatter his dream before she left for good. Elias stood there, the clock ticking behind him, its chime ringing hollow as she ran out again, leaving him alone with the pieces of a day that would never be. The shop grew quiet after that. Elias stayed behind his workbench, the wedding clock untouched on a shelf, its hands stuck at noon, a silent witness to his loss. The town whispered, about Anna's flight, Jacob's heartbreak, Elias's silence, but he didn't care. He worked alone, fixing clocks for strangers, his hands moving through the motions while his heart stayed broken. Anna didn't call, didn't write, and he didn't chase her. She'd chosen her path, and he'd lost her to it. Days turned to months, then years. Elias aged fast, his hair graying, his back stooping under the weight of his grief. The shop felt empty without her laughter, the clocks ticking on like a cruel echo of the life he'd planned. He'd see her sometimes in his mind, twirling in that dress, her eyes bright, and his chest would ache, a dull, steady pain he couldn't fix. The wedding clock gathered dust, its gears still, a monument to a love he'd given everything for, only to watch it slip away. Anna stayed gone, chasing Sam across the country, her life a blur of highways and bar gigs. She'd think of her father, his quiet pride, the clock he'd made, and guilt would stab at her, but pride kept her silent. She loved Sam, loved the freedom he gave her, but the cost haunted her, a shadow she couldn't outrun. Elias passed one winter, alone in his shop, his heart giving out as he wound a clock that wasn't hers. The town buried him quietly, the wedding clock sold off with the rest of his things. Anna heard too late, returning to Asheville years after, her hair streaked with gray, Sam long gone to another road. She found the clock in a pawn shop, its hands still at noon, her initials scratched on the back. She wound it with trembling fingers, the chime ringing soft and clear, and sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She'd lost him, her father, the man who'd built her a future she couldn't take. Before moving to the next story, don't forget to subscribe and comment down where you're listening from. Nick froze mid-sip, his beer halfway to his lips, as a burst of laughter floated through his open window. Across the alley, in the warm glow of her kitchen, a woman danced, arms swaying, hips twisting to a tune he couldn't hear. She was a stranger, just his neighbor, but in that moment, she was everything. His heart thudded, loud and unsteady, and he leaned closer to the glass, captivated by her joy, her freedom. He didn't know her name, but he knew he'd watch her every night from now on. Nick lived in a small, cluttered apartment on the third floor of a rundown building in Denver, a city where the jagged peaks of the Rockies loomed against the urban sprawl. The walls were thin, the paint peeling in curls, and the air carried a faint, whiff of grease and stale beer. His days were spent at a garage downtown, hands buried in engines, the clank of tools and hum of machinery drowning out the quiet ache in his chest. At 32, he'd carved out a life of solitude, his nights ending at his window, a beer in hand, the city lights flickering like distant stars below. He wasn't always alone by choice. Growing up, Nick had learned to shrink himself. His father's fists and sharp words had taught him that love came with a cost. His mother had been a ghost in their home, silent and resigned, and when Nick fled to Denver after high school, he carried that weight with him, a shyness that clung like oil, a fear of being seen and found wanting. His apartment reflected it. Mismatched furniture scavenged from thrift stores, a sagging couch, a single photo of his parents on the wall, their faces stern and faded. Then he saw her, Sarah, though he didn't know her name yet. Her kitchen window faced his, across the narrow alley, a stage lit by soft yellow light. She was a nurse, he figured, from the scrubs she wore when she stumbled home after long shifts, her shoulders slumped, but her eyes bright. She'd dance alone in her kitchen, swaying to music he couldn't hear, her laughter drifting through the open window like a lifeline. She'd chop vegetables with a steady hand, humming off key, or collapse on her couch with a book, her face softening in the lamplight. To Nick, she was a mystery and a dream, a glimpse of a life he longed for, but couldn't touch. He started watching her every night, his breath catching as he pieced together her world. The scent of garlic and basil would waft across the alley, mingling with the stale air of his room, and he'd imagine sitting at her table, her smile warming him as they shared a meal. He'd see her cat, a gray tabby, curl on the windowsill, her fingers scratching its ears, and wonder what her touch would feel like, gentle and sure. He built stories around her. She was kind, he decided, from the way she waved at kids in the hallway. She was tired but strong from the late hours she kept. In his mind, he'd talk to her, simple things like, rough day at the garage, or you dance like no one's watching, but the words never made it past his lips. Fear held him hostage. He'd rehearse conversations, his heart racing as he paced his apartment, but the thought of her rejection stopped him cold. What if she thought he was strange, some creep staring through her window? What if she had a boyfriend, someone better, someone braver? His father's voice echoed in his head, calling him worthless, and the girls from school who'd mocked his stammer flashed in his memory. So he stayed silent, his love a secret he nursed through the glass, a one-sided bond that grew with every glimpse. There were moments when he came close. Once they met in the hallway, her arms full of grocery bags, and she flashed a quick, polite smile. "Hey," she said, her voice soft, and Nick's throat closed up. He nodded, his palms slick with sweat, and bolted to his door, cursing himself as it clicked shut. Another time, she waved from her window, a friendly lift of her hand, and he froze, his pulse hammering, before ducking out of sight. Each near miss left him reeling, his chest tight with regret, but the fear was a wall he couldn't breach. One night, as the clock ticked past midnight, Nick settled by his window, his beer cold against his palm, waiting for Sarah's light to flick on. But her kitchen stayed dark, the curtains still. He frowned, a knot of worry twisting in his gut. She was always home by now. Maybe she'd taken an extra shift, or maybe she was out with friends. He tried to brush it off, but the unease grew, sharp and insistent, as the hours stretched on. By morning, her window was still empty, and Nick's mind raced with dread. Was she hurt? Sick? He paced his apartment, the floorboards creaking under his boots, his thoughts spiraling. He grabbed a pen and scrawled a note. "Hi, I'm Nick. I live across the alley. Are you okay?" But his courage faltered. He crumpled it, tossing it into the trash, his hands trembling. She didn't know him. He had no right to ask. Days dragged on, and Sarah's window remained dark. Nick's worry hardened into a hollow ache when he saw a moving truck parked outside her building, movers hauling boxes and furniture down the stairs. His stomach plummeted, his feet moving before his brain caught up. He stumbled into the lobby, breathless, and cornered the doorman. "Where's she going?" he demanded, his voice rough. "Moved out," the man said, flipping through a newspaper. "Got married last weekend. Her and her fiancé are starting over in Boulder." The words hit Nick like a punch. Married, she was gone. Gone to a life he'd never touch, a happiness he'd never know. He staggered back to his apartment, his chest tight, his breath shallow. He'd lost her, and he'd never even tried to reach her. The silence in his room roared, the empty window across the alley. Nick sat by his window that night, staring at the dark kitchen where Sarah used to dance. The alley was quiet. He'd loved her from afar, built a world out of stolen moments. Her laughter, her tired smiles, her off-key hums. But it was all a mirage, nothing he could hold. His fear had kept him safe, but it had stolen everything. He thought of the note he'd thrown away, the words he'd never said, the chances he'd let slip by. He'd pictured 1,000 lives with her, quiet dinners, her hand in his, her voice filling his empty spaces. But now she was gone and he was alone. Weeks passed and he tried to move on. He buried himself in work, his hands steady as he fixed engines, his mind numb to the noise. But at night, he'd catch himself looking across the alley, hoping for a light that never came. New tenants moved in, a young couple, their laughter sharp and bright, but it wasn't her. It never would be. Before moving to the next story, don't forget to subscribe and comment down where you're listening from. Amy wasn't supposed to be alone. At 24, she'd fled Syria 2 years ago, escaping the bombs that had taken her parents and her little brother, Sammy, in a single, shattering night. She'd been a teacher once, reading stories to kids in a dusty classroom, but war had stripped that life away. Now, in Istanbul, she was a refugee, living in a cramped apartment with other displaced women, stitching clothes for pennies, her days a blur of survival. The photo of Sammy, grinning with a missing tooth, was all she had left, a weight she carried in her pocket, a reminder of everything she'd lost. Michael had his own ghosts. 31, an American journalist from New York, he'd come to Istanbul chitting stories of the refugee crisis, his camera a shield against the world. He'd lost his sister, Lucy, a year ago. Car accident, quick and cruel, and the guilt gnawed at him. He'd been driving, arguing with her about nothing, and hadn't seen the truck until it was too late. Since then, he'd roamed, writing articles that won awards, but couldn't fill the hole she'd left. Istanbul was just another stop, another way to run from the silence back home. Their paths crossed that night on the Galata Bridge, a stretch of concrete linking Europe and Asia, crowded with fishermen and tourists by day, quiet and lonely after dark. Amy had wandered there, her mind heavy, the photo trembling in her hands as she'd stared at the water below. Michael had been walking off a bad day, another interview that ended in tears, another story he couldn't fix when he saw her. She was small, her scarf slipping, her eyes wide with a pain he recognized. He didn't know why he stopped. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was Lucy's voice in his head. But he did. They didn't speak much at first. She understood some English, enough to nod when he asked if she was okay, and he didn't push. He offered her a cigarette from the pack he carried, though he rarely smoked, and she took it, her fingers brushing his. They stood there, leaning against the railing, the city's lights twinkling across the water, sharing a silence that felt less empty than being alone. It was the start of something neither expected. Days turned into weeks, and the bridge became their place. They'd meet after her shifts or his deadlines, sitting on a bench with cheap tea from a street vendor, the steam curling between them. She'd tell him about Sammy, his goofy laugh, how he'd chase stray cats, and he'd talk about Lucy, her wild hair and louder dreams. Language stumbled between them, her broken English, his few Arabic phrases, but they made it work, filling gaps with gestures and smiles. He'd snap photos of her sometimes, her face soft in the dusk, and she'd blush, swatting his camera away. Their bond grew quiet and steady. He'd bring her little things, a scarf when hers frayed, a book of poetry she could barely read, and she'd slip him sketches she'd drawn on scraps, scenes of Assyria she remembered. They'd walk the bridge at night, her hand brushing his arm, his shoulder close enough to lean on. Love crept in, gentle but fierce, a warmth that thawed the ice around their hearts. They didn't say it, didn't need to, but it was there, a bridge of its own, spanning the worlds they'd come from. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Michael waited on their bench, his camera resting beside him. Amy was late, unusual for her, and his stomach twisted with a worry he couldn't name. When she finally appeared, her steps were slow, her face pale, her hands empty of the photo she always carried. She sank beside him, her breath shaky, and he knew something was wrong. She didn't speak at first, just stared at the water, her fingers twisting in her lap. Then, in halting words, she told him the police had raided her apartment that morning, rounding up refugees for deportation checks. She'd hidden Sammy's photo in a crack in the wall, but when she'd gone back, it was gone, lost to the chaos, maybe swept away by a stranger's hand. It was the last piece of her brother, her anchor, and now it was ash in her mind, like everything else she'd lost. Michael's chest tightened, his own grief surging up to meet hers. He reached for her hand, his grip firm, but she pulled away, her eyes brimming with tears she wouldn't let fall. "I can't stay," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They'll send me back, or worse." She'd heard rumors, camps, borders closing, and fear had rooted deep. She was planning to run, to vanish into the city or beyond, anywhere she could hide. He felt the ground shift beneath him. He'd lost Lucy, and now Amy. His light in this dark place was slipping away too. He wanted to beg her to stay, to promise he'd fix it, but he knew he couldn't. She was a refugee. He was a visitor. Their worlds didn't bend that way, but he couldn't let her go alone. Not like this, not into the unknown. His heart raced, torn between the life he'd built and the love he'd found, and in that moment, he made a choice. Michael didn't let Amy disappear. He grabbed her hand again, this time holding tight, and pulled her close, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "We'll figure it out," he said, simple words that carried everything he couldn't say. She looked at him, her eyes wide, searching, and then nodded, a fragile trust blooming between them. They didn't have much, just his savings, her courage, but it was enough. He used his journalist contacts, calling in favors to find a lawyer, a loophole, anything to keep her safe. Days blurred into nights, spent in cramped offices and quiet corners, fighting a system that didn't care. Amy stayed by his side, her sketches piling up, pictures of the bridge, of him, her way of holding on. It wasn't easy. Papers were lost. Officials turned them away, but they kept going, their hands clasped like a lifeline. Months later, they won. A visa, a chance. Amy wouldn't go back to Syria, wouldn't vanish into the shadows. They left Istanbul together, boarding a plane to New York, her head resting on his shoulder as the city faded below. She'd lost Sammy's photo, but Michael gave her a new one, a snapshot he'd taken of her on the bridge, her face soft in the light, a piece of her he'd saved. She held it tight, tears slipping down her cheeks, and whispered a thank you he felt in his bones. In New York, they built a life, small, messy, real. Amy learned English, found work teaching kids again, her voice steady as she read them stories. Michael wrote, his articles sharper now, fueled by her strength. They'd walk the Brooklyn Bridge sometimes, her hand in his, the wind tugging at their coats, and smile at the memory of where it started. They'd crossed worlds, hers shattered by war, his broken by loss, and found each other on the other side, a love that held firm against the dark. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, steady and true, a bridge they'd never let fall. Thank you for spending this time with me. The story may be over, but the gentle rain will keep you company a little longer. Rest well and I'll see you in the next video. Good night.